Before we get to today's show, I'd like to mention that although ID the Future is free content, it's not free to produce. If you're enjoying the interviews, commentaries, and readings you hear on the podcast, would you consider partnering with me to create more new content next year? Discovery Institute depends wholly on donations from people like you who are excited about the work we do. Become an ID the Future partner today to help us produce new episodes and expand the reach of the podcast. Support the ID the Future podcast directly by going to idthefuture.com and clicking on the donate button at the top of the page. That's idthefuture.com and click on the donate button at the top of the page. Thanks for your support.
So my first advice is don't borrow money to go to college. My second advice is, do you really need to go to college to do science? Maybe practicing in a lab, even temporarily for a year or two, will give you some of the background information you need in order to pass some of those difficult science courses.
ID the Future, a podcast about evolution and intelligent design.
Welcome to ID the Future. I'm your host, Andrew McDiarmid. Today, I conclude my conversation with engineer, inventor, writer, and self-taught scientist Forrest Mims. In his 2024 memoir, Maverick Scientist, Mims recounts his many adventures as an amateur scientist. In previous episodes of ID the Future, we've discussed highlights of his career as a writer and a scientist, including his time writing books on electronics for Radio Shack, how he used his own homemade instruments to point out errors in NASA's own atmospheric data, his dust-up with Scientific American magazine, his experience winning a Rolex Award, his work in twilight photometry, his adventures at the world-famous Mauna Loa Observatory, the list goes on. Our topic today, though, is integrity in science. Now, in part one of this conversation, we discussed the role of skepticism in science, as well as the role of method in scientific research. Forrest shared personal stories and examples from his career in science. In part two, we discussed the role of values in science and the role of the scientist in society. Forrest will also share some of his own advice to young scientists based on what he has learned through decades of work as a scientist. Now, if you're not yet familiar with Forrest, here are a few things you should know about him. Named by Discover magazine as one of the 50 best brains in science, Mims has forged a distinguished scientific career despite having no academic training in science. He has published over 60 books with publishers that include McGraw-Hill, Prentice Hall, Radio Shack, and others. His Radio Shack books alone have sold over 7.5 million copies. Mims's scientific papers have appeared in a number of peer-reviewed journals, including Nature, Science, the Journal of Molecular Evolution, Applied Optics, and others. His columns have been published for popular readers in Scientific American, Popular Electronics, Modern Electronics, The Citizen Scientist, Make Magazine, and other outlets. He has also consulted for a number of official scientific bodies, including NASA, NOAA, and the Environmental Protection Agency. All right, it's time. Let's jump back into my conversation with Forrest now. And even kids in high school can make important scientific discoveries and maybe at first rebuffed by the pros, the professional scientists. But if you're persistent and you have good data, even high school kids can do this. Tell us about your daughter, Sarah, and what she discovered.
Sarah has a professionally peer-reviewed paper from the 11th grade. In the 10th grade, she did a science project every year. Her 10th grade project was based on Sahara dust, and it's more commonly known now than it was back then when she was in the 10th grade. We're talking about 15 or 20 years ago. Mm-hmm. But she was measuring the dust coming from Africa in our field using microscope slides. And she would get a microscope and she'd count the particles and everything. And Charlotte changed during August and September. There's a lot more dust then. I drove her to the science fair. She got to the International Science Fair in Dallas-Fort Worth. When we were driving back, she said she wondered what she could do for the next year. And I said, I've heard that there could be living microorganisms in dust, but I've never heard of anybody detecting it coming from Africa. So then she got Petri films, which are little culture things that they use in restaurants and in kitchens to look for E. coli and other bacteria. It's just you peel back a layer and you've got a film of material that's sensitive to these bacteria. So she bought some of those, and she bought some that work for yeast. set those outside. Bingo. On the day with the most haze, which was smoke from Yucatan, she was getting bacteria and fungal particles on these films. And
Hmm.
we did an experiment. I said, why don't you build a fire in that trash can and put some dried grass in there? So she did that. Put her films, her biofilms, on a stick. Put it over the smoke, not the fire. But when it was over the smoke, it got all kinds of hits from bacteria and fungi. Whereas in the clear air next to the smoke, it got hardly any. So bingo. And so she was onto something really, really important because nobody discovered this. So we
Wow.
took her to these were in smoke from fires in Yucatan. And that smoke drifts across the Gulf of America, comes to Texas, and that's what she was detecting. Well, to avoid being told that the bacteria were coming from Texas instead of the Gulf, we drove her to Padre Island. And she flew a kite with an air sampler made for, with a paper cup and a glass microscope slide, 25-cent air sampler. She got numerous of these spores from that microscope flown from a kite. So we drive her back when there's no smoke in the fall, and she got almost zero particles on her plate. So bingo, that proved that the air from Yucatan contains these microorganisms. That was her science project. It became the lead paper in the journal, the American, in the major leading atmospheric science journal. I've forgotten the name of
Yeah.
it. It became the lead paper, the very first paper in the journal. And it's now been referenced over 50 times in the scientific literature. And it
Wow.
started a new field of science. The new field of science is called pyroaerobiology. Pyro meaning fire. Pyroaerobiology. And a scientist at the University of Utah started this and has followed in Sarah's footsteps and referencing her paper and her papers.
Hmm. Wow. Well, and what a cool father-daughter experience to have, huh?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, that's probably that paper is extremely important because it proves that you can transport these microbes considerable distances where they can do harm when they land on plants or people 1,000 miles away.
Right. Yeah. And so a new field has opened up to pursue this more, huh?
Yes.
Wow. Well, there's another section in the booklet on being a scientist called Values in Science. I appreciated this statement in there. It said many of the intangible influences on scientific discovery, curiosity, intuition, creativity, largely defy rational analysis, yet they're among the tools that scientists bring to their work. It goes on to say that values cannot be separated from science, and even notes that the value of religious convictions about the nature of the universe have also led to important scientific insights. So, should scientists be trying to separate their science from their values, or should they simply be honest about how their values impact their science?
Well, I had to be honest about that in my first memoir and my second memoir, Maverick Scientist. Listen, when I reach a big problem in my science work, I go to the ultimate source of help, God. I simply pray for help. And that began when I was building transistorized radars for the blind that you hold in your hand. They're very, very small. My great-grandfather was blind, and that's what interested me in that project. And I was trying to build one of these on eyeglasses when we lived in New Mexico. I could not build a circuit that small. And I could today by using surface mount components, but back then there was no way I could do that. I gave up, and I finally just prayed to the Lord and said, I cannot do this on my own. Please help me build this. I'd never prayed about my science, never.
Hmm.
2 days later, my eyeglass aid for the blind was built and being tested with a blind student at the University of New Mexico. Thanks to God's answer to my prayer. I don't know how it happened, but I was able to build that very tiny circuit very quickly after that prayer.
Hmm. So scientists don't need to necessarily separate their science from their values. They just need to be candid and honest about how their values impact things then. Is that right?
Precisely.
Yeah.
Remember that the most famous amateur scientist of all time was Michael Faraday. We would not be having this discussion if it were not for Faraday's inventions of various forms of light and transmission of light and so forth. He even came up with the various laws of radio communications. He didn't have the mathematics ability, but he had the novelty ability in his mind. He went to church every Sunday. In fact, he got kicked out of a leadership of his very conservative church when he went to see the Queen. Queen Victoria wanted an audience with this famous scientist, and so he went on a Sunday morning and got in big trouble. And
Hmm.
they put him on the back bench of his church for a couple of years. Then they put him back up front. He became the head of various scientific societies, worldwide scientific societies. The man was a total genius, and he built his science on his faith.
So yeah, and you can look back through the history of modern science and see that same approach. Scientists, doing good science not in spite of their faith, but because of it,
Yes.
inspired by it. Fueled by a desire to study what they consider to be an intelligible universe. We see that all the way through the history of modern science.
Yep, you're right.
Yeah.
By the way, Faraday also invented the precursor of the electric motor. So he was a and he was also a great chemist.
Hmm.
He did, and he also, every year he did what was called a Christmas lecture to children just before Christmas. These are very famous lectures. I will tell you, I can assure you that it's difficult to understand some of these lectures because they were so sophisticated, yet there's children in the audience rapidly listening to every word he said.
Mm. So he could relate to people and was a good teacher then too.
Yes.
Hmm, that's awesome. Well, let's talk about respect between scientists, as in that famous Aretha Franklin song, RESPECT. Uh,
Yeah.
One way scientists respect each other is by giving credit where it's due. Now, why do you think this is important to science? And what have you learned about this personally in your career?
Well, there are some scientists who plagiarize their research. That's a minority, but some who do that. I've had some of my things I've had entire articles in Scientific American plagiarized by a writer who put them in a book, and
Mm,
he changed my hometown from Texas town to some other town. He didn't. Everything else is identical, word for word. McGraw-Hill was the publisher. They pulled the book after they found out about that. But you want some basic integrity between scientists. Uh, uh, I can't really think of a situation where I was at war with a scientist. I've disagreed with him on various things, but we've never gotten into a big argument or anything like that. I've done all this work for NASA. I've got an instrument, a $20,000 instrument in my field that NASA sent here. Been using it for like almost a decade now, measuring the atmosphere every day. We may differ on various things. I know that one scientist at NASA had big political posters in his office that I totally disagreed with. But we
mm,
were best friends. We were best friends. We never argued about politics.
mm. Yeah, respect is key, isn't it? When you're trying to get to the bottom of things and study phenomena in nature.
Yes.
Very important. Now, you mentioned something about uh, giving honorary bylines with science papers. What's that about?
That's a toughie. Oh gosh. I've faced that problem several times. Like for example, Dong Wu is his name. He and I are co-authors on that paper about the tropopause. But that's because he headed the NASA, the Goddard Space Flight Center that gave me the grant to do that work. They hired me for 2 years. And
Mm,
so he was an integral part of that. He provided the equations that I needed, that I couldn't provide
yeah.
on measuring the height of the atmosphere and so forth. So that was legitimate. Uh, uh, One paper I wrote had 5 co-authors, and I was the second author on that paper, not the lead author. And some of the co-authors, I wasn't directly with them when they did their contribution, but I do know they did their contribution. But so whether or not they should have been co-authors, I'm not sure, but I didn't argue about it. And then I'm going to have uh, my friend in California, Dr. Steve Davis. He used one of the instruments I built for NASA, or had arranged to be built for NASA, 20 some odd times in near Santa Barbara, California, or Southern California, and then 20 or so evenings in near Los Angeles. So beautiful data from a dry, clear area and a very, very polluted area. That's very important. He's going to be a co-author on my paper about my twilight research. So will a fellow who lives in Alabama. His name is Don Wilcher. He's got an honorary doctorate. He he designed the printed circuit boards for this little circuit here. This is a complete twilight photometer right there. It's all the electronics. The
Mm,
LED is on the LED is on this side. And this here comprises a complete twilight photometer if you add a 1-inch telescope tube and the lens. This here has this inside. There's two of
Okay.
these inside with batteries and switches and all. So Don designed this board. He's going to be a co-author. I'll be the lead author because I invented the board and I do all the circuitry, and I'll do all these measurements. So I'll have two really legitimate co-authors, and then I'll be the lead author.
Okay. And that reminds me of the fact that, you can work as an individual doing science, but the importance of collaboration is there too, because, you're not an isolated island. You do have to collaborate. You have to share data. You have to work together to make something bigger. And you're sort of illustrating the importance of that.
And when the potential collaborator tells you something won't work, in my experience, that means it will work. Sarah was told her project was not valid because the fungal spores and the bacteria were being burned up in the fires, the biomass fires. He didn't realize that if you make a fire, yes, there's a fire in the middle and everything above it is burned up, but there's smoke and hot air coming up along the side, transporting all those things that Sarah was detecting. So he was wrong, yet he's a leading PhD in the field of atmospheric pollution of these particles. And then
Wow.
I've had a lot of experiences like that where people told me something wouldn't work. Um, I wrote an article for a magazine called Outlook for the Blind, New Outlook for the Blind, and it was about my little aids for the blind. And the editor of this magazine had a brother who was a PhD physicist. He said they sent him my article. He said, "There's no way this works. This guy's not on the level with you." And I wrote back and I said, he may think that, but he hasn't seen the device and he doesn't know that I actually invented it and built it and have been recognized for building it, and that 20 blind people have used it. They accepted my side of the story and published my article. So sometimes you run into people who are skeptical of your science because you don't have the degree, but that's very, very rare. That hasn't happened to me in many years. Now, it may happen to me when I'm claiming I can measure water vapor in the atmosphere. Weather balloons only go up to 30 kilometers, 120,000 feet or so. And so above that, they don't know what the water vapor is. There's a microwave method and there's a satellite method of looking at water vapor above that. My twilight instruments measure water vapor up to 70 kilometers in the mesosphere.
Wow.
That's incredible. And there was none of that when I was using my early instruments before that big volcano. There was no water vapor up there. Now, after Hunga Tonga, this historic volcano, there's tons of water vapor that were never there before. And most scientists believe it's going to stay there for 10 years, where it's going to cause a slight warming increase because water vapor is the most important greenhouse gas, not carbon dioxide.
Yeah, and that's really important. Yeah, and your experiences that you're relaying just again prove, the importance of pushing past that initial doubt or closed-mindedness that some people might have to your work just because they're not familiar with it or they don't know enough about it. You've got to have that tenacity to push past that and encourage
Right.
people into your data and your work.
It also means that you better do the work before you publish it. You better make sure that like that's what I'm doing right now. I mean, that's what my next field trip is going to, in this RV that I'm sitting in, will be to take two of these, actually three of these, to the Texas Gulf Coast where I took them 2 years ago, and show the greatly improved data that I'm getting with these. They will make my paper far better than if I was using the older instruments that I had developed for NASA.
Right. So the importance of solid data.
Yes.
Yeah. Well, at the close of the booklet that we're talking about today is a section on the role of the scientist in society. One part of it caught my attention. I'm reading from the second edition. It says that scientists must take the time to relate scientific knowledge to society in such a way that members of the public can make an informed decision about the relevance of the research. And then it says, sometimes researchers reserve this right to themselves, considering non-experts unqualified to make such judgments. But science offers only one window on human experience. While upholding the honor of their profession, scientists must seek to avoid putting scientific knowledge on a pedestal above knowledge obtained through other means. Whoa. I mean, this is the National Academies of Science back in 95 writing this.
Yeah,
That's
yeah.
a frank acknowledgement of the role of humility in science. Now, here we are 30 years later. Do you think that statement still reflects the scientific enterprise today?
Unfortunately, I think that I hate to say this, but I think the climate change movement has changed that statement so that
Mm.
that statement is not taken nearly as serious as it was back then. That needs to come
Oh,
back. That needs to be present in the new version of their booklet, no matter what they do. And they obviously had some really good scientists back then in order to make that statement.
yeah. Yeah, this so that people know, this little booklet, it comes from the National Academies of Science, but there's a committee of scientists from different fields that were called upon to put it together, and but it just shows you how frank and honest they were being about,
Yeah,
the role of science, and how it's not the only way to knowledge, and understanding of the world. A lot of
yep,
humility there, and I think we need
absolutely.
to come back to that. Well, we've gotten a glimpse into this training manual for young researchers from the National Academies of Science, but let's give Forrest the last word today. What would your top advice to young people be who are maybe interested in pursuing science as a career?
Okay, number one, if you go to college, don't borrow money.
Mm,
Unfortunately, there are a lot of people who graduated from college with $100,000 debts, and if they go for a PhD, it could be a lot more than that. They're getting enough. Some of these students are getting enough debt to where they could pay off a house. They will never pay it off in their lifetime. And so what's happening? They want the government to have the population pay them back. I say, no, don't do that. All my kids graduated without any debt whatsoever, all three of them. I didn't have any debt whatsoever. But if our kids had debt, my wife and I would feel obligated to help them be making their monthly payments. So my first advice is don't borrow money to go to college. My second advice is, do you really need to go to college to do science? Maybe practicing in a lab even temporarily for a year or two, will give you some of the background information you need in order to pass some of those difficult science courses. Now, I must admit, I could never pass a course in calculus. I barely understood enough calculus to write the equations to calculate the altitude of these aerosols that I measure. Uh, that's just my weakness. When I was a freshman in college, I wanted to major in physics, but my algebra grade was 69 and 2/3, which the professor rounded off to a 70, and I passed algebra. But I quit physics. I decided I can't major in physics because I'm too dumb. I just simply lack the mathematical expertise. But I do have the ability to build and design electronic circuits. That's all
hmm
that was necessary. So when the school newspaper at Texas A&M, the battalion, did a front page story about my aid for the blind that you could hold in your hand and detect objects 10 feet away. They called me an Aggie Edison. Well, when that came out, the vice president for research at Texas A&M had me come to his office, and it was in May. We're going to graduate in 3 weeks. He wants me to quit the graduation ceremony. My major was government and minored in English. And he wants me to go back to school and get a degree in science. I told him there's no way I would fail all the math. I couldn't do it. He says, well, I want you to go see the electronics building anyway and see what those guys are doing. So I did that. I went to the electronics building, walked up to the second floor, turned left. There was an open door, and there were a bunch of cadets. We were cadets back then. And they were building electronic circuits while standing up at workbenches. And on the blackboard were all these equations I could not begin to understand. They were
Mm,
building vacuum tube circuits. I couldn't believe that. I went to my dormitory just as happy as I could be because I was building transistorized circuits, and I was using the very first light-emitting diodes ever invented. Texas Instruments gave me 3 of these $365 infrared emitting diodes, and I was transmitting my voice from my dorm room to the Memorial Student Center parking 1,000 feet away. And I was doing all this science. I didn't need all that degree stuff. So that vice president for research kindly understood that I lacked that mathematical ability. He
hmm
believed in me enough so that I was going to Vietnam. He wrote a letter to his friend who was a science advisor to General Westmoreland, who was in charge of all the soldiers. Make a long story short, the Air Force ends up assigning me to the Air Force Weapons Laboratory, which required a PhD or master's degree in engineering. And I worked there for 3 years. That's where I met my wife. She was a secretary there. So you don't have to have a science degree to do good science, including science published in leading peer-reviewed journals.
mm. Just lean into the the talents and the skills that you have already and add to them, but you don't necessarily need the fancy degrees to do well what you can do already. Well,
Exactly.
yeah. Well, Forrest, it's always a pleasure to sit down and talk with you and pick your brain about things. And thank you for enlightening us about this booklet that they're giving young scientists from the National Academies of Science, just to be integrous, in your science. It's a very important component of the scientific pursuit.
Yep, sure is.
Well, Forrest, we'll come back to you very soon with another helping of your insights from a very long career that is still going. Right, you've got goals that are coming up. There's something about 50 years. What was the thing that you're setting for 50 years of study
I,
or?
I've got 30 years of atmospheric data measuring the ozone, the total water vapor, and the optical depth of the atmosphere. In other words, how the atmosphere is dimmed by smoke and dust and air pollution. I have
Mhm.
published a paper, a 30-year paper in Bulletin of the American Meteorological Society. And by the way, all these papers undergo peer review. And I pray to God that I'll live to 50 years, to have 50 years of data and publish a 50-year paper. I now have 35 years, by the way. That paper was published 5 years ago. And God willing, I'll have a 50-year paper. And that will include not just the daily measurements I make, but also the twilight measurements, which are really fascinating.
Yeah. Well, you're an inspiration to me and to many others, not just for your electronics work, but for your dedicated data collection and scientific study that you're still doing. It's really amazing. Now, folks, if you've not read Forrest's book that he put out, that would be a good place to start. It talks about his many adventures as a self-taught scientist, and it's called Maverick Scientist. You can get a copy. Let's see, where's the best place for us for people to grab a copy?
Probably Amazon.
Okay.
And
Yeah.
they can read there's a lot of reviews about the book on Amazon that people can read.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so available at Amazon and anywhere good books can be ordered. It's called Maverick Scientist, chock full of insights and stories that are educational as well as inspiring. That's the memoir Maverick Scientist. Now, you also have a website if people are curious about the data you're collecting. That's forrestmims.org, right?
Right.
Okay, and Forrest is spelled with 2 R's, of course. Not the forest with all the trees, but Forrest double R, and forrestmims.org is your website. Well, thanks again, Forrest. Until next time.
Thank you
Appreciate
very
it.
much. Thank
Well,
you.
for ID the Future, I'm Andrew McDiarmid. Thanks again for joining us.
Visit us at idthefuture.com and intelligentdesign.org. This program is copyright Discovery Institute and recorded by its Center for Science and Culture.